Ever wondered how medieval bakers created that perfect sourdough without modern yeast? Step back in time to uncover the ancient techniques that gave rise to the bread we love today, and why these methods are disappearing faster than you can say rise and shine. Get ready to rediscover lost baking secrets that modern kitchens forgot. Sourdough has a rich history that stretches back to ancient civilizations, but it gained particular prominence in medieval Europe as a fundamental part of daily life. During the medieval period, sourdough was not just a method of bread making, but a symbol of sustenance and survival. In an era before refrigeration and modern yeast cultivation, sourdough was the primary method of fermenting dough, providing a reliable source of nutrition for people across the continent. Medieval bakers didn't have the luxury of commercial yeast or instant rise methods. Instead, they relied on wild yeasts and bacteria naturally present in the environment. These microorganisms were responsible for the long, slow fermentation process that gave sourdough its distinct tangy flavor and airy texture. The process was not only a method of bread making, but a skill passed down through generations, refined over time, and ingrained in daily life. Sourdough is vital for people in all walks of life, from peasants to royalty. It was particularly essential in the diets of peasants, who lived in rural areas and had limited access to commercial resources. With no ovens in every home, villagers would often bake their bread communally in large ovens, often run by local guilds. These communal ovens helped foster a sense of community, as families would often take turns baking their bread and share in the preparation process. In addition to its role as a staple food, sourdough also had a cultural and economic significance. The process of cultivating wild yeast, baking bread, and preserving it over time was an art form tied to local resources. In the absence of preservatives, the ability to maintain a healthy sourdough starter was vital for long-term bread production. Families would pass down starters that had been nurtured for years, sometimes even centuries. The health of a sourdough starter was often a closely guarded secret, and each region developed its own distinct flavor profile based on local wild yeasts and the grain available to them. Sourdough bread also played an essential role in religious and social rituals. Bread was a common offering in religious ceremonies, and the act of breaking bread together symbolized unity and shared responsibility. Many medieval cultures believed that the act of baking sourdough could even have spiritual benefits, as the slow fermentation process mirrored the cycles of nature and the rhythms of life. Thus, medieval sourdough was more than just a food item. It was an essential part of the cultural fabric, offering nourishment, social connection, and even spiritual meaning. While modern baking methods have largely replaced traditional sourdough techniques, the medieval origins of this bread method continue to inspire those seeking to reconnect with the past. Medieval bakers employed a wide range of techniques to harness the power of wild fermentation, ensuring that their bread had the right texture, flavor, and preservation qualities. Unlike today, where commercial yeast is widely available, medieval bakers depended on natural microorganisms, mainly wild yeasts and bacteria found in the environment, to ferment their dough. These yeasts were cultivated from the air, flour, and even the baker's hands, which created a distinctive flavor profile that varied from region to region, depending on the local yeast strains. The process of fermentation in medieval times was far slower than the rapid rise methods used in modern baking. Dough would be mixed and left to rise for several hours or even overnight, allowing the natural yeasts to grow and proliferate. In some cases, the dough was left to ferment for up to 24 hours, with the wild yeasts slowly breaking down the sugars in the flour and creating carbon dioxide, which caused the dough to rise. This long fermentation process was essential for developing the characteristic tangy flavor of sourdough, which resulted from the lactic acid produced by the wild bacteria during fermentation. One crucial element in medieval sourdough techniques was the cultivation and maintenance of a starter culture. Instead of relying on a one-time yeast packet, bakers would carefully cultivate their starters over time, passing them down through generations. These starters were a mixture of water and flour that had become inoculated with wild yeasts and bacteria from the environment. Every time a baker made a new batch of dough, they would take a portion of the starter and add it to the new batch, maintaining a consistent fermentation environment. This practice allowed bakers to produce consistently flavorful bread, with each starter developing a unique character shaped by its environment and the care given to it. Another key aspect of medieval sourdough fermentation was the use of wooden tools and natural fermentation vessels, which contributed to the development of flavors. Bakers would use wooden troughs or large clay vessels to mix and ferment their dough. These materials allowed the dough to breathe and fostered the right environment for the wild yeasts to thrive. Wood, in particular, was a preferred material because it absorbed and released moisture in a way that helped maintain the perfect balance of humidity during fermentation. The wild yeast strains that grew in these vessels were adapted to the local climate and environment, giving each region's bread a distinct flavor. The medieval process of sourdough fermentation was as much about understanding the environment as it was about technique. Bakers would closely observe the weather, temperature, and humidity, all of which affected the fermentation process. The yeasts and bacteria in the air would respond differently depending on these factors, which meant that the same sourdough starter could behave differently in the summer than in the winter. This close relationship with nature made medieval bakers highly skilled at managing their fermentation environments, often relying on instinct and experience to produce the best possible bread. Medieval sourdough baking involved not just the right ingredients and techniques, but also a variety of specialized tools that were integral to the process. While modern bakeries have machines and automated processes, medieval bakers had to rely on simple, yet effective tools crafted from materials readily available to them. These tools, ranging from large wooden paddles to communal ovens, were designed to help bakers handle the dough, maintain heat, and ensure that the bread was properly shaped and baked. One of the most important tools in medieval sourdough baking was the wooden paddle, known as a peel. The paddle was used to slide the dough into the oven and retrieve the bread once it had finished baking. These paddles were typically made from large, flat pieces of wood with a long handle, allowing the baker to safely transfer loaves in and out of the oven, which would often be very hot. The surface of the peel was sometimes dusted with flour or cornmeal to prevent the dough from sticking, and the paddle itself was often treated with a mixture of flour and water to help maintain its smooth surface. In some cases, bakers would even carve intricate designs or symbols into the paddle, making it both a functional and decorative tool. Bakers also used large wooden fermentation vessels or troughs to mix and knead the dough. These vessels were often long, wide, and deep, providing enough space for the dough to expand during the fermentation process. The size and shape of these troughs were important because they allowed the dough to be evenly exposed to air and facilitated the slow fermentation process. Wooden surfaces were particularly ideal because they could absorb moisture, which helped maintain the proper humidity for fermentation. Additionally, the wood would gradually accumulate a layer of natural yeast over time, creating a beneficial environment for the dough to rise. The ovens used by medieval bakers were also distinctive and vital to the process of baking sourdough. These ovens were typically large brick or clay structures, designed to hold a significant amount of heat. The heat source could come from wood, coal, or charcoal, and the oven itself would often be heated for several hours before the bread was placed inside. The intense heat and slow baking process in these ovens allowed for the development of the characteristic crisp crust of sourdough, while the dough inside remained soft and airy. The ovens were usually communal, meaning that many families would bake their bread at the same time, each contributing their dough to be cooked in the same oven. This communal baking fostered a sense of community and shared responsibility. In addition to the peel, fermentation troughs, and ovens, medieval bakers also used other tools like dough scrapers, mixers, and storage jars. Dough scrapers were used to help shape the dough and scrape it out of fermentation vessels, ensuring that no dough was wasted. Storage jars, often made of clay or ceramic, were used to keep the sourdough starters alive and thriving. These tools were simple but highly effective, enabling bakers to create high-quality sourdough with limited resources. These medieval tools were not only functional, but also reflected the craftsmanship and skill required to produce good bread. They embodied a connection to the past, where each tool had its purpose and was maintained with care. While modern tools have replaced many of these traditional implements, the basic principles of handling dough, managing heat, and fostering fermentation remain at the heart of sourdough baking. The types of grains used in medieval sourdough were crucial to the bread's texture, flavor, and nutritional value. Unlike today, where the focus is predominantly on wheat flour, medieval bakers used a variety of grains that were more readily available in their local environments. This diversity of grains influenced not only the bread's taste but also its health benefits, making medieval sourdough a complex and deeply regional product. Rye, barley, spelt, and even oats were common grains used for baking, and each contributed distinct characteristics to the final loaf. Rye was one of the most popular grains for sourdough during the medieval period. It was particularly suited for the colder climates of Northern and Eastern Europe, where it grew better than wheat. Rye flour, which contains less gluten than wheat, resulted in a denser, darker bread with a rich, slightly sour flavor. The acidity produced during the fermentation process was more pronounced when rye was used, making rye-based sourdough more tangy and robust compared to other types of bread. Rye also had the added benefit of being more resilient to poor soil conditions and harsher climates, making it a staple grain for peasants and rural communities. Barley was another important grain in medieval sourdough baking. While it was not as commonly used as rye, barley flour was still a significant component of medieval diets, particularly in the regions surrounding the Mediterranean. Barley bread was lighter than rye bread, with a more neutral taste, and was often used to make loaves for people who could not afford the more expensive wheat bread. Barley also had a higher fiber content compared to wheat, making it a nutritious choice for those relying on bread as their primary food source. Barley-based sourdoughs had a slightly milder tang, making them more palatable for some, though still rich in flavor. Spelt, an ancient grain related to wheat, was another key ingredient in medieval sourdough baking. Spelt was highly valued for its ability to withstand adverse growing conditions and its nutritional benefits. It has a nutty, slightly sweet flavor, and its flour contains a higher protein content than modern wheat, which gave spelt bread a more substantial texture. The use of spelt in sourdough resulted in bread that was both tender and hearty, with a light, airy crumb and a distinctive taste. Medieval bakers often chose spelt because it was one of the oldest grains known to humans, and its cultivation was deeply tied to agricultural traditions. In addition to rye, barley, and spelt, medieval bakers sometimes used oats in their bread recipes. Oats were often mixed with other flours to make bread that was more easily digestible, especially for people with weaker stomachs or digestive issues. Oats added a mild, earthy flavor to sourdough and gave the bread a soft, chewy texture. While oats were not the primary grain used in bread baking, they were still a popular choice, especially in regions where oats were abundant, such as in the British Isles. The diversity of grains used in medieval sourdough not only made the bread more flavorful but also influenced its ability to ferment. Each grain has a different carbohydrate structure and interacts with wild yeast and bacteria in unique ways. Rye, for example, contains more sugars that wild yeasts can feed on, resulting in a faster fermentation process. Barley and spelt, on the other hand, required a longer fermentation time to develop their flavors fully. Medieval bakers would have been highly attuned to these differences, adjusting fermentation times and techniques to account for the type of grain they were using. These ancient grains, with their varied properties, are now being rediscovered by modern bakers seeking to reconnect with traditional baking methods. The distinct flavors and textures that these grains contributed to sourdoughs have largely been lost to modern baking, which predominantly relies on wheat. However, there is a growing movement to bring back these ancient grains in order to recreate the unique sourdoughs of the medieval era, offering a taste of history that is both nutritious and deeply rooted in tradition. As modern baking methods evolved, many of the techniques and traditions surrounding medieval sourdough were gradually abandoned or altered to suit more efficient mass production processes. Today, the rapid rise of bread in hours rather than days, the use of commercial yeast over wild fermentation, and the reliance on refined wheat flour have drastically changed the texture, flavor, and nutritional value of bread. However, this shift has also sparked a resurgence of interest in the traditional methods of sourdough baking, with a focus on reclaiming the lost techniques of the past. One of the most significant aspects of medieval sourdough that has been lost in modern baking is the relationship between the baker and the environment. In the medieval era, bread making was an intimate process, closely tied to the natural world. Bakers had to be keenly aware of local conditions such as temperature, humidity, and even the time of year, as these factors influence the fermentation process. The wild yeast present in the air, on the flour, and in the tools all contributed to the flavor and texture of the bread. Today, commercial yeast strains are cultivated to be more predictable and efficient. But this predictability comes at the cost of flavor complexity and regional uniqueness. Reclaiming these traditional methods means returning to a slower, more deliberate approach to baking that requires patience, intuition, and a deep connection with the natural environment. The ancient grains used in medieval sourdough are another area where modern baking has shifted. While wheat is the dominant grain used in contemporary bread production, medieval bakers often relied on a variety of grains such as rye, barley, and spelt. Each of these grains provided different flavors, textures, and fermentation properties, contributing to the diversity of bread available in medieval times. Unfortunately, the dominance of wheat in modern bread has led to a loss of these rich and varied flavors. The renewed interest in ancient grains and their return to modern sourdough recipes is part of a broader movement to revive the flavors and nutritional benefits that these grains provided. Another lost technique is the use of communal ovens and the slow, ritualistic process of bread making. In medieval times, bread was often baked in communal ovens, where families would gather to bake their loaves and share in the process. This communal aspect of bread making was not only practical but also social, bringing people together and fostering a sense of community. In contrast, modern bread production is often isolated, with many people baking in their own homes or relying on factory-made loaves. By returning to communal bread-making practices, we can revive a sense of shared responsibility and connection to the process of creating food. Additionally, communal baking often led to a more sustainable approach, with shared ovens minimizing waste and energy consumption. The health benefits of traditional sourdough methods are also drawing attention. The long fermentation process used in medieval sourdough allowed for a more digestible bread that was easier on the stomach and better for overall gut health. The wild fermentation process encourages the growth of beneficial bacteria, which aid in digestion and contribute to a more balanced gut microbiome. Modern bread, with its quick fermentation and use of commercial yeast, lacks these health benefits, as more people seek to improve their gut health and overall well-being. The slow fermentation of traditional sourdough is seen as a healthier option. Reclaiming these lost techniques means returning to a slower, more thoughtful approach to bread making, one that values tradition, community, and health. By reconnecting with the methods of medieval sourdough bakers, we can revive a piece of culinary history and bring back flavors and practices that have long been forgotten. This revival is not just about recreating old recipes, but about embracing a deeper understanding of how bread is made, how it connects us to our environment, and how it nourishes us in both body and spirit. Through this process, modern bakers are rediscovering the art of sourdough, creating a bridge between the past and the present, and ensuring that these ancient methods continue to thrive in the future. Enjoying the journey through medieval baking. Make sure you don't miss out on more hidden history and timeless techniques. Hit that subscribe button and join the community. Stay tuned for more content that brings the past to life, one loaf at a time.